Mariah Benson, a respected community organizer, was spending a quiet afternoon at the park with her husband Troy. The scene seemed ordinary at first. Sunlight spilling through branches, children's laughter echoing from a nearby playground, joggers passing by with earbuds. Mariah had chosen this park deliberately. It was one of the few places she could breathe easily, a break from meetings, petitions and the endless calls for justice that filled her days. She was known for her calm presence at protests, the way she soothed tensions and kept people focused on the cause rather than chaos. Troy admired that about her. As they sat on the worn wooden bench, he reached for her hand, the silver band of her wedding ring glinting in the light. They spoke about their upcoming anniversary and the new youth program Mariah was planning for the neighborhood. It was a moment of respite, a glimpse of normalcy in lives dedicated to struggle and survival. The park itself was alive with stories: an elderly man feeding pigeons, a couple taking engagement photos under an oak tree, teenagers leaning against their bikes and laughing at private jokes. Mariah felt safe here, wrapped in the familiarity of her community. She'd walked these paths countless times, spoken at this very gazebo during voter drives, handed out food boxes to the unhoused along its perimeter. This was her home turf, a place where her reputation carried weight. She believed that mattered, that even authority would see her as more than a name on a clipboard. She had no reason to expect confrontation. Troy, a mechanic with steady hands and a quiet strength, had always been her anchor. He wasn't as outspoken as Mariah, but he showed up to every rally, every late-night planning session, always ready to set up tables or drive elders home. Sitting beside her, he noticed the subtle lines of exhaustion on her face, the toll of constant advocacy. He squeezed her hand and whispered something to make her laugh. For a moment the tension in her shoulders softened. They were just another married couple enjoying an afternoon outside. They didn't notice the patrol car creeping up along the curb or the uniformed officer stepping out until his shadow fell across their bench. Lieutenant Mallory, a local officer notorious for aggressive policing, approached the couple under the guise of a routine check. His reputation preceded him. In certain neighborhoods, his name was spoken with a mixture of fear and resentment, a shorthand for harassment cloaked in procedure. He had built his career on a brand of authority that blurred the line between maintaining order and exerting dominance. Residents had filed complaints before, about unnecessary stops, rough treatment, property searches that left belongings scattered, but little ever stuck. Mallory wore his impunity like a badge, as visible as the one pinned to his chest. As he walked toward Mariah and Troy, his boots heavy on the gravel, he projected a calculated air of casualness. A routine check, he would say if questioned, just another day on the job. But his eyes swept over Mariah's clipboard and tote bag with something sharper than curiosity. He had seen her at city council meetings, heard her voice rise from crowds demanding accountability. In his mind she wasn't just a woman on a park bench, she was a challenge to his authority. That knowledge shaped every step he took toward them. He opened with clipped commands, his tone already suggesting that resistance would not be tolerated. "Let me see your ID," he said, though there was no apparent violation or cause. Mariah blinked, startled by the sudden intrusion into their peaceful moment. She asked calmly why he needed it. Mallory's lips tightened, and his posture shifted imperceptibly, a predator scenting defiance. Troy felt the change too. He sat straighter, his hands still on Mariah's but his eyes locked on the officer. Mallory's reputation for escalation was well earned. He knew how to turn questions into resistance, how to frame hesitation as interference. He had learned that the system rewarded decisive force, not patient explanation. As Mariah's voice remained even, asking again for the reason behind the demand, Mallory reached for her arm, fingers closing just above her elbow. The move was quick, practiced. To onlookers it might appear procedural. To Mariah, it felt like a deliberate assertion of power, a reminder of how easily dignity could be stripped away. The wedding ring that had glinted moments before slipped from her finger in the scuffle, hitting the pavement with a sound that cut through the noise of the park. The symbol of her partnership, her stability, lay in the dirt as her purse was jostled and then torn open, papers fluttering to the ground like fallen leaves. Mallory didn't pause. He treated her belongings as obstacles, his focus fixed on establishing control. Troy rose from the bench, his voice rising in disbelief and anger, but Mallory's arm shot out, shoving him aside with a practiced motion that sent him stumbling. By now heads were turning. People nearby slowed their steps, drawn by the unmistakable cadence of confrontation. Some reached for their phones, others whispered. The air shifted. Mallory sensed it but pressed on, believing his uniform still held sway over the crowd. His approach was a performance as much as an enforcement, an unspoken lesson in who was allowed to question authority and who was not. Mariah's heart pounded as she crouched to gather her scattered items. This was not just a personal humiliation, it was public erasure, a stripping away of the image she had so carefully built as a leader, a voice for the voiceless. She had spent years organizing against exactly this kind of treatment. Now she was living it. The officer's shadow swallowing her small frame as Troy struggled against the cuffs closing around his wrists. The park, once a place of respite, had transformed into an impromptu arena. Children's laughter faded. Pigeons scattered. The couple who had been taking engagement photos moved back. Eyes in every onlooker's phone camera. The scene would look unmistakable. A man in uniform asserting his power over a woman already known for challenging the system. Her husband restrained for trying to intervene. Mallory, despite the eyes on him, did not falter. He believed humiliation was a weapon, one he could wield publicly to discourage not just Mariah, but anyone watching from daring to follow her example. This was the moment when everything began to shift. When the story that started with a quiet afternoon at the park crossed an invisible line into something larger, heavier and far more dangerous. It was no longer about a simple ID check or a misunderstanding. It had become a test of will, an illustration of how authority reacts when confronted with dignity that refuses to bow. Without explanation, Mallory demanded Mariah's ID, escalating tension with every clipped command. The words left his mouth like bullets, short, staccato, devoid of warmth or reason. Identification. Now, he didn't phrase it as a question or a request, but as a verdict already handed down. Mariah blinked up at him, the sun catching in her eyes, and for a second she thought of every workshop she had ever run on knowing your rights, how she always told young people to stay calm, to document everything, to ask for a reason but never give one to be arrested. Those lessons now looped in her mind as she tried to steady her breath. She asked gently, "Officer, what's the issue? We're just sitting here." Her voice was measured but inside her pulse raced. Mallory's jaw tightened. He had approached hundreds like her, and he recognized the tone, educated, composed, not easily intimidated. It annoyed him more than outright defiance. He leaned closer, his shadow engulfing both of them, and repeated, "ID." Right now, Troy shifted, feeling his stomach. He had grown up around this dance between citizens and uniforms. He knew the rules. Don't reach too fast. Don't raise your voice. Keep your hands visible. But watching his wife, his unshakable calm Mariah, being spoken to like a suspect cracked something inside him. "Sir, she asked you a question," he said quietly but firmly. That was the pivot point. Mallory's eyes flicked to Troy, measuring him, assessing if he would be trouble. He took a step back and placed his hand on the radio at his shoulder. The crowd's noises grew dim to Mariah, as she focused on the officer's movements. He hadn't explained any probable cause. He hadn't given a reason for intrusion. This was pure intimidation disguised as procedure. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her purse. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of calling it non-compliance. She fumbled for her wallet, but before she could retrieve it, his hand shot out, seizing her arm as though she were already a flight risk. The grip was firm, practiced, a reflex of control. Mariah gasped, not from pain but from shock. She felt the weight of eyes on her now, the collective attention of strangers. She tried to pull her arm back, not yanking, just resisting enough to reclaim her space. "Please don't touch me," she said, her voice still steady but breaking at the edges. Troy rose to his feet completely now, his chair scraping against the pavement. He could feel his heart hammering against his rib. Every part of him screamed to step between them, to shield her, but he hesitated, aware of the uniform, the badge, the consequences. Mallory's voice dropped into that low register officers use when they want compliance through fear. "You're interfering," he muttered to Troy without even looking at him. Then louder, to Mariah, "Stop resisting." The phrase hung in the air like a threat. She wasn't resisting, she was barely moving, but in Mallory's world, words like that could justify anything. The wedding ring slid off her finger as she shifted, hitting the ground with a tiny metallic crack. She glanced down at it, the flash of silver on concrete, a cruel metaphor for everything she stood to lose in this moment. Her purse strap gave way under Mallory's tug, spilling its contents, receipts, pens, a folded flyer for an upcoming community forum, scattering across the ground. People were slowing their walks now. A mother pulled her child closer. Two teenagers stopped and whispered, pulling out their phone. The atmosphere had changed from a casual park scene to a tense tableau of power. Mariah bent to pick up her things, but Mallory's hold on her arm prevented her from moving freely. She was conscious of her body, her posture, the camera. She wanted to look strong, not like a victim, but humiliation was creeping in like a cold wind. Her mind flashed through headlines she had read, Names of women and men who had ended up on the evening news after routine stops gone wrong. She couldn't believe she was becoming one of them. When Mariah asked for a reason, the officer accused her of resisting, and reached for her arm. The accusation felt absurd, like an inverted mirror image of reality. She had done nothing but sit and ask a question, yet the word resisting dropped with the weight of an official charge, rewriting the scene as if she were already guilty. Mallory's fingers clamped around her upper arm more firmly now, his thumb pressing against muscle. The contact wasn't yet violent enough to leave a mark, but it radiated power, a warning of what could come. Troy's instincts ignited. He stepped forward, his hands slightly raised to show he wasn't a threat. "Sir, please, she's not resisting. She just asked you a question," he said. His voice shook but carried. Mallory's head snapped toward him and his free hand shot out, shoving Troy in the chest. The motion was swift, dismissive, as if pushing aside an object rather than a person. Troy stumbled back a step, catching himself on the bench. He felt a wave of shame at being handled so easily, but his shame was quickly replaced by a searing anger. The crowd's presence was growing. Someone whispered, "Start filming." Another muttered, "Here we go again." The click of phone cameras felt like a drumbeat building around them. Mariah heard it too, a chorus of potential witnesses, and clung to that thought. Maybe documentation would protect them. Maybe someone would speak up. She looked at the officer, his face impassive except for a flicker of irritation at the phone. He yanked her upright, still holding her arm, and barked at Troy, "Stay back. You're under arrest for interference." Troy's eyes widened. "What?" His voice cracked across the park. He hadn't even touched the officer, but Mallory was already pulling out cuffs, metal glint. He twisted Troy's arms behind his back with practiced efficiency. Troy gritted his teeth at the pressure on his shoulders, but didn't resist. He stared at Mariah as if to tell her with his eyes to stay calm. Don't give them an excuse. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes but willed them away. She wouldn't break here. Not like this. Mallory's confidence swelled with each movement. This was his script, his arena. He believed that making an example out of them would reassert his dominance. In his mind, there was no question of right or wrong. There was only control, and the appearance of authority. He didn't see a married couple in a park. He saw a threat to be neutralized. He reached down to collect Mariah's fallen ID from the pavement, but ignored the wedding ring still lying there. The ring caught the light again, a tiny beacon of defiance amid the dust. Troy could feel the cuffs biting into his wrists. His breath came fast, his chest tight. He looked around at the crowd, at the phones raised like witnesses, and something inside him began to shift. He had always deferred to Mariah in matters of protest, always been the quiet support, but watching her be treated like this, watching his own dignity reduced to nothing in front of strangers, flipped a switch. His hands flexed in the cuffs, testing them. They were cheaper than the heavy-duty ones used at the precinct. Standard issue for patrol. The thin chain rattled softly. Mariah saw the change in him. Even with his arms pinned, his shoulders straightened. She wanted to reach for him, but Mallory still had her pinned by the arm. She could hear people shouting now. "That's not right. Let them go." The sound was swelling. She drew in a deep breath and spoke as clearly as she could. "I'm not resisting. We've done nothing wrong." Her voice rang out like a statement for the record, echoing over the murmur. Mallory's smirk flickered just slightly. He had performed this kind of public assertion of power before, but rarely with so many cameras, rarely with such a composed subject. He tightened his grip, trying to move them both toward his patrol car. The crowd pressed closer to the invisible line, some stepping onto the grass for a better view. Children were ushered away. The tension was now palpable, a living thing coiling around the scene. Troy's muscles bunched. He thought of every time Mariah had told him, "We have to stand firm but stay safe." He thought of how the system expected compliance no matter how wrong the situation. He thought of his wife's ring on the ground, his wife's body being handled like contraband. His breathing slowed. In the stillness of that moment, as Mallory barked into his radio for backup, Troy's fingers wrapped around the thin chain of the cuffs. He felt the metal strain, his skin pinched, the cold steel biting into his palms. But something in him had shifted beyond fear. All around them the crowd was no longer silent witnesses, but murmuring, muttering, recording, becoming a chorus. Mariah's heart thudded. She could feel the ground shifting under them. Not physically but in the sense that this was no longer a simple confrontation. It was becoming something larger, something charged. Her wedding ring slipped off as she stumbled. It clinked onto the pavement, symbolizing her public humiliation. The noise was barely audible over the gathering sounds of the park, but to Mariah it felt like an explosion. It was the same ring Troy had placed on her finger with trembling hands in front of their friends and family. It was the one constant she never removed. even during marches and long nights of planning meetings. Seeing it roll on the rough concrete between the officer's boots turned her stomach. She instinctively bent to retrieve it, but Mallory's grip on her arm prevented her from moving. His thumb pressed into the soft inside of her elbow, an assertion of control, a reminder of where she stood. Her purse, torn open from his rough handling, spilled its contents onto the ground. Flyers about the community garden, receipts from their grocery run, her wallet with the youth program's donation envelopes. All of it fluttered like debris around them. It wasn't just her belongings being scattered, it was her work, her dignity, fragments of her life laid bare before strangers. Troy watched with a kind of stunned disbelief. He could see the ring gleaming on the ground, and could do nothing. He could see his wife's papers being stepped on by passers-by and could do nothing. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to step in, to end the spectacle, but his wrists were now pinned behind his back by Mallory's steel grip. The officer had shoved him aside as if he were an inconvenience, not a man trying to protect his wife. The crowd was growing thicker. People had stopped pretending to look away. Phones were held up at chest level, their small red recording lights blinking. Murmurs of "what's going on and this isn't right" drifted over from the edge of the park path. Mariah caught snatches of those words, and clung to them as if they were lifelines. Her hand twitched again toward the ring. Mallory barked hands up and yanked her upright. She steadied herself and raised both hands slightly, palms open, breathing hard but keeping her eyes fixed on the metal circle lying so close she could almost touch it with her toe. She thought of the promise Troy had made when he gave it to her. "This is ours, no one takes this from us." And how now, in front of the entire park, someone was taking everything without even acknowledging its meaning. She felt heat rise behind her eyes but forced it back. She would not cry. She would not give the cameras an image of a broken woman. Mallory crouched briefly to scoop up her wallet, but ignored the ring. To him it was meaningless. His attention was on asserting control over the scene before the backup he had called arrived. The ring lay in the dirt like an accusation, catching the sunlight. A little boy in a red hoodie stared at it, then at Mariah, his mother tugging him away by the hand. Around them the park's normal sounds had thinned to a low hum. Pigeons had scattered. A skateboarder sat on his board, phone aimed steadily at the unfolding scene. The sense of a tipping point was almost physical. A change in the air. Troy shifted his weight, his shoulders rolling under Mallory's hold. He thought of the many nights Mariah had told him stories of people humiliated by the system. Stories he had nodded through, angry but powerless. Now it was their story. He had always been the quiet one, the fixer, the one who set up tables and built the stage for her speeches. Watching her be treated like this while his own wrists were locked, filled him with a hot, still rage he barely recognized. He glanced at the ring again, lying a foot from his boot, and something in him hardened. When Mariah asked for a reason, the officer accused her of resisting and reached for her arm. The word landed like a false stamp on a clean page. "Resisting," he said again, louder, projecting it for the camera. She froze, realizing how easily a single word could twist a narrative, how quickly woman asking a question could become aggressive suspect. She thought of the headlines, the official statements that always started the same way. "The suspect resists." She spoke slowly, carefully. "I'm not resisting, I just asked you why." But Mallory's grip only tightened. Troy stepped forward as much as the officer's hold allowed. "She's not resisting, she just wants to know why you're doing this," he said. His voice cracked but carried. Mallory turned, eyes cold, and with his free hand shoved Troy back again. It wasn't a full blow, just a rough push, but it was enough to make him stagger. The crowd gasped softly. Someone said, "I'm getting this on video." Another voice called, "This is harassment." Mariah's head whipped toward the voices, trying to find solidarity in the blur of faces. Mallory barked at Troy to stay back and yanked out a pair of cuffs. "You're under arrest for interference," he announced. The phrase was mechanical, delivered without emotion, but it felt like a trap snapping shut. Troy's arms were forced behind his back. The metal bit into his wrists, cold and tight. He didn't fight. He kept his eyes on Mariah. She looked back, her mouth opening as if to speak but no words coming out. It was a silent exchange of fear and determination. Her pulse thundered in her ear. She could hear the crowd murmuring, feel the weight of phones pointed at her, but Mallory's body between her and Troy was all she could see. He pulled her a step toward the patrol car, still gripping her arm. Her papers crunched under. The ring remained on the ground behind them, a tiny glinting reminder of what had been scattered. Mariah wanted to reach back for it, to reclaim something, anything, but Mallory's hold and the eyes of the crowd held her still. She thought of all the young people she had taught to stand their ground, to stay calm. She wondered if they would see this footage later, and what they would think of her now. She wondered how far this would go. She wondered how she and Troy could hold on to each other's dignity in a moment designed to strip them of it. Passers-by began filming the incident, their phones capturing the raw scene. At first it was only a few discreet clicks, people holding their devices at waist level, but within seconds lenses rose higher, some trembling in the hands that held them. The sound of a notification tone rang out like a signal, and more phones appeared, their little red lights blinking. Mariah could feel each one like a spotlight, magnifying her humiliation, but also promising a record she might need later. Her heart beat against her ribs, as she tried to keep her breathing even, aware that any sudden move could be misread. She scanned the crowd for a sympathetic face, and caught fragments of whispers. "Get his badge number. This is crazy." But no one stepped forward. Troy's eyes darted around too, noting every camera, every witness, the way the crowd's energy was shifting from curiosity to indignation. A low rumble building, that felt like a storm. Mariah's scattered belongings lay underfoot as strangers documented everything, and for the first time she sensed the possibility that the story was no longer just theirs, but had begun to belong to everyone watching. The crowd's murmurs grew into shouts of protest, as the officer pushed Mariah to her knees. At first the noise was scattered, individual voices calling out "help" or "stop," as though each person was trying to test the edge of their own courage. Then it began to blend together, overlapping fragments of outrage, that became a single low roar. Mariah heard it as if through water. Her knees hit the pavement, sharp pain radiating up her legs, and her palms braced instinctively on the ground. The grit of tiny stones dug into her skin. Her hair fell forward over her face, and she tried to push it back, to straighten up to regain some semblance of dignity. But Mallory's hand pressed between her shoulder blades, holding her down in a position that made her feel both exposed and powerless. She had stood before city officials and hostile crowds. She had faced threats and insults, but never this, to be physically forced onto the ground in public like a spectacle. The smell of the concrete, warm from the sun, mixed with the scent of grass and sweat and fear. Troy's voice reached her, ragged and frantic. Even with his hands cuffed, he tried to step toward her, his shoulders twisting against the metal. "Get your hands off her," he shouted, the words cracking. Mallory turned just enough to shove him back with his hip, still keeping one hand on Mariah. The crowd surged closer by a few steps. A skateboard clattered to the ground somewhere, the sharp sound ringing out like a starting gun. Someone yelled, "Leave her alone." Another voice, higher and trembling, called, "We're recording you." Phones tilted, lenses catching every angle. Mariah pressed her palms flat against the ground, feeling the pulse of her heartbeat, there as if the earth itself were trembling with her. She thought of the training sessions she had run, the advice she had given about how to respond to law enforcement. Keep your voice calm. Keep your body language neutral. Document everything. She was doing all of those things, and still she was on her knees, her purse contents scattered, her ring lost somewhere behind her. Humiliation washed over her like a second skin. But through the humiliation there was a flicker of something else: awareness. Every camera raised around her meant there would be evidence. Every murmur meant people were witnessing. Even in the midst of her fear, she was cataloging details: the officer's badge number, the time of day, the layout of the park, as if she were already preparing her own testimony. Mallory's voice cut through the noise, low and commanding. "Stay back," he barked at the crowd without looking at them, his tone an attempt to reassert authority. But the people didn't retreat. A woman with a stroller angled herself to the side, phone held high. Two teenagers who had been on bikes now stood shoulder to shoulder, arms crossed, watching intently. A man in a business suit had stopped and was muttering into his phone, perhaps calling someone, perhaps live streaming. The officer's posture stiffened. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him now, 1,000 tiny judgments pressing in. He was trained to handle suspects, not audiences. Mariah slowly lifted her head. Her hair clung to her damp forehead. She wasn't crying, not yet, but she could feel tears threaten. She inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. "I'm not resisting," she said loud enough for the cameras, her voice rough but clear. "We haven't done anything." The words were less for Mallory and more for the crowd. For the record. Troy's breath hitched when he heard her speak. He straightened his back, his eyes scanning the ring of spectators. Their faces were a mix of anger, fear and something like anticipation. Mallory tugged at Mariah's arm, as if to haul her upright, but the movement only made the crowd inch closer. Someone shouted, "What's your badge number?" Another yelled, "You can't treat people like this." The officer ignored them, but his jaw tightened. His grip on Mariah was still firm, but there was a flicker of doubt now. This was no longer a routine show of force. This was a performance with an unwilling audience that could rewrite the script at any moment. He glanced toward the edge of the park where his backup had yet to arrive. The seconds felt longer. Troy's heart pounded. He could feel the thin chain of the cuffs biting into his wrists. His muscles flexed instinctively against the restraint. He watched Mariah on her knees, the officer's hand on her back, and felt something inside him snap like a wire under too much tension. He remembered every protest they had attended together, every chant about dignity and justice, every time she had told him to keep his cool. He had always been the quiet one, the one who followed her lead. But this was different. This wasn't a crowd they had organized or a city meeting they had planned for. This was their life being turned into a public lesson. He looked at the phones raised around him, and felt his anger turn into a kind of clarity. The murmurs became a low chant from somewhere at the back of the crowd. Let them go. Let them go. It started soft, just a few voices, but it spread, the words repeating and overlapping, until they became a rhythm. Mariah heard it, and felt a jolt of strength run through her. She pressed her hands to the pavement, shifted her weight, tried to rise a little. Mallory pushed down on her shoulder, but his pressure lacked the same confidence as before. The chant grew louder. Troy took a step forward, the cuffs cutting into his skin. He could feel the thin metal bending just slightly under the pressure of his wrists. He thought of his father teaching him to fix engines, of the calluses on his hands, of the nights he had come home exhausted, but still helped Mariah print flyers. He thought of the way she had smiled at him that morning before they left the house. All of it converged into a single point of resolve. He twisted his wrists harder, feeling the chain strain. His eyes never left Mariah. Around them the crowd's chant filled the air like a drumbeat. Mallory barked into his radio for backup, his voice louder now, betraying a hint of urgency. His hand shifted on Mariah's arm, and she used the moment to rise halfway to her feet. Troy's breath slowed even as his heart raced. He felt the cuffs give a fraction more. The metal pinched his skin, but he didn't stop. He rolled his shoulders, flexed again, testing the weak point. Another small sound from the chain, almost lost in the noise. His muscles trembled with effort. He glanced at Mariah, and she saw the look in his eyes, a look she had never seen before, calm and fierce at the same time. She straightened a little more despite Mallory's grip, her chin lifting. She didn't speak, but her eyes told him she understood. The crowd was no longer a backdrop, but a force of its own. People were leaning forward, their faces lit by phone screens, some shouting, some whispering, some just staring. The chant had become a roar, and even those who weren't chanting were murmuring, or clapping or holding their phones higher. A man near the front stepped closer and called out, "We're all witnesses. Let them go." Another voice echoed, "We see you." The officer's hand twitched at his baton, but he didn't draw it yet. He was surrounded not by an organized protest, but by a spontaneous assembly, unpredictable and volatile. Mariah's scattered papers fluttered underfoot. Someone bent down, picked up one of her flyers, looked at it, then looked back at her as if realizing who she was. Recognition spread in ripple. She wasn't just a random woman on the ground. She was someone who had stood up for them before. That recognition added fuel to the crowd's energy. The chant shifted into shame. Shame for a few beats, then back to let them go. The sound reverberated off the trees and playground structures, filling the park with a strange electric unity. Troy's hands clenched. He gave one final twist, putting all his weight into it. The chain of the cuffs groaned audibly this time. Mallory's head snapped toward him, sensing movement. "Stay still," he barked, but his voice cracked. Troy straightened to his full height, his shoulders squared. The cuffs bit once more into his skin, and then with a sharp metallic snap, the link gave way. The broken pieces clattered to the pavement like a punctuation mark. For a heartbeat, the park went silent, except for the birds in the distance. Troy stood free, his wrists raw and red but his posture unbowed. He took a step forward, placing himself between Mariah and the officer. The crowd gasped and then roared. Phones zoomed in. Someone yelled, "He broke the cuffs." Another shouted, "They're free." The sound of the chant surged back, louder than before. Mariah felt herself pulled upright by his presence, her back straightening, her breath returned. She reached for his hand without thinking, and he clasped hers, their fingers interlocking tightly. Mallory's baton cleared its holster in a blur, but Troy caught his wrist mid-swing. The movement was fluid, almost inevitable, the kind of motion that comes not from planning but from something deeper. Mallory tried to yank his arm back, but Troy held firm. The baton wavered in mid-air between them. Mariah's eyes widened as she watched her husband, usually so calm, now a wall of quiet strength. The crowd shouted, some in warning, some in awe. The officer's forehead glistened with sweat. He had not expected this.
Not here. Not. Troy twisted the baton just enough to make Mallory lose his grip. It clattered to the ground beside the scattered papers. The crowd erupted again, the noise almost physical in its force. Phones caught every second, broadcasting it to feeds and timelines far beyond the park. Mariah and Troy stood side by side now, the ring still lost but their hands clasped, facing the officer. Around them the crowd pressed closer, a living, breathing witness to what was unfolding, their voices rising like a tide.
Mallory smirked, believing the couple had been subdued. To him the broken cuffs were a fluke, an anomaly he could still fold back into the narrative of control if he moved fast enough. His eyes darted from Troy's raw wrists to the faces in the crowd, then back again. He straightened his shoulders, forced a curl of disdain onto his lips and stepped forward as if he still held the upper hand. That smirk was the mask he had learned to wear through years of confrontation, the expression that told suspects he was unshaken, even when his pulse betrayed him. It was also the smirk of a man who had built a career on predictable responses: fear, compliance, silence. In his mind the crowd was just noise and cameras, not a real force, and this husband and wife were just another pair of names on his shift report. Troy felt the smirk like a slap. He had spent his whole life reading faces on shop floors, in waiting rooms, in boardrooms where he was invisible. He knew the look of a man who thought he could win by pretending to be calm. That look told him Mallory still saw Mariah as a target, still saw him as an obstacle, still believed the performance of authority would outweigh the reality of the moment. He stepped forward, closing the space between them, his body no longer shrinking under the uniform's shadow. Mariah's fingers tightened around his. She could feel the tremor running through him, but also the steadiness, the rootedness of someone who had decided he would not move back again. The phones surrounding them created an eerie glow, small rectangles of light floating like fireflies in the dimming afternoon. Each one was a portal carrying the scene outward into homes, onto feeds, across cities. Mallory sensed it too now. He could no longer pretend this was a private act of enforcement. Every breath, every twitch of his hand was being documented, parsed, judged. The smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he forced it back. He barked, "Step back," at Troy, but his voice lacked its earlier edge. The command landed flat against the wall of noise from the crowd. Troy didn't step back. He planted his feet the way his father had taught him to plant them when lifting an engine block. Solid, unshakable. He felt the ache in his wrists, but ignored it. The image of Mariah on her knees, of her ring on the ground, of her papers trampled underfoot, replayed in his mind like a reel of fuel feeding a slow fire. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't even breathing hard anymore. He was simply there, a barrier of flesh and resolve between the officer and his wife. Mariah drew a slow breath and lifted her chin. The sting in her knees from where they had hit the pavement was still there, but she felt herself rising inside, shoulders back, eyes fixed on the man who had tried to reduce her to an object lesson. Mallory's training told him to regain control quickly, to issue clear commands, to separate the couple. But another part of his brain was whispering calculations. How many phones, how many faces, how close the crowd was now. He could smell the sour tang of adrenaline on his own skin. The baton lay on the ground, out of reach. Backup still hadn't arrived. He adjusted his stance, trying to project calm, but his fingers twitched near his belt. He was caught between the script he knew and the reality unfolding in front of him, and for the first time he wasn't sure which move to make. He pulled in a breath and took a step toward them, his boots crunching on scattered papers. Troy didn't move. Mariah's gaze didn't flicker. Around them the crowd murmured, an almost physical pressure building. Someone called out, "We're live streaming this." Another voice shouted, "We know who you are." Each statement tightened the net around Mallory's performance. He felt the smirk slide off his face as if it had become too heavy to hold. His jaw clenched. His eyes flicked to the patrol car, to the street beyond, calculating distance and risk. Troy's voice finally came, low but resonant, carrying more weight than a shout. Enough. It was just one word, but it cut through the noise. It was not a plea. It was not a threat. It was a line drawn. Mariah felt a jolt go through her at the sound of it. She had spoken at rallies about dignity and rights, but she had never heard that tone from him before. A tone that was not about argument or persuasion, but about presence. The crowd hushed for a beat, their chant breaking into a ripple of anticipation. Mallory heard it too. He felt the air shift, the crowd leaning forward, a moment hanging between escalation and retreat. He tried to regain his footing, to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His training had not prepared him for silence as a weapon. He reached down slowly, fingers brushing the baton on the ground. Troy's eyes followed the movement, his body tensing. Mariah's hand squeezed his, anchoring him, her breath steady now. The phones zoomed in. The distance between the three of them was no more than a couple of feet, but it felt like the center of the world. Mallory's fingers closed around the baton's handle, but he didn't lift it yet. He glanced up and saw his own reflection in dozens of lenses, his own posture frozen in time. Mariah shifted her weight slightly, stepping closer to Troy, so that their shoulders touched. She could feel the heat of his arm, the steadiness of his presence. She remembered every time she had told him that their struggle was about more than them, that the system counted on people to stay quiet and alone. Now here they were, together, not silent, not alone. She raised her head and spoke clearly, her voice carrying "We are not afraid." It wasn't a slogan she had planned to say, it came from somewhere deeper. The crowd erupted with a cheer, a release of tension. Even those who had been silent began to chant, to clap, to raise their phones higher. Mallory's grip tightened on the baton. The cheer hit him like a gust of wind. He felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had been certain humiliation would break them, that the sight of cuffs and force would make them compliant, that the crowd would stay at the safe edge of watch. Instead, the couple in front of him stood like a single pillar, and the crowd had become a living organism with its own voice. He was no longer an officer in control of a scene. He was a man standing at the center of a storm of his own making. Troy kept his eyes on him. He didn't lunge, didn't shout. He simply stood there, his chest rising and falling slowly, his body blocking Mariah from Mallory's reach. He could hear the crowd behind him, feel the rumble of their voices through the ground. He thought of the broken cuffs at his feet, of the ring still lost somewhere on the pavement, of Mariah's hand gripping his. He thought of how everything had been stripped away in minutes and yet something else had been forged in its place, something harder to break than metal. Mallory opened his mouth, but whatever words he meant to say were drowned out by the crowd's roar. It rolled over them in waves, not organized, not directed, just raw and human. Phones trembled in the air. Mariah straightened, her eyes never leaving the man who had pushed her to her knee. She could feel her pulse in her throat, but her voice when it came again was steady. She repeated, louder, "We are not afraid." This time others picked it up, a call and response, echoing through the park. Mallory felt the ground tilt beneath him. The smirk was gone, the script was gone. All that remained was the reality of two people, who refused to be broken, and a crowd that had decided to see them as more than just another incident. Troy could feel the crowd behind him shift from a restless audience into something heavier, more deliberate. The chants that had begun as scattered bursts of outrage were now a rolling tide of sound, moving in waves that vibrated through his chest. He didn't even have to turn around to know that people were stepping closer, that strangers were moving to stand shoulder to shoulder, their phones raised but their eyes fixed on him and Mariah. It was no longer a circle of observers. It had become a wall of bodies. Each person seemed to carry a small piece of the couple's humiliation and anger, and the air between them felt charged, like the seconds before a summer storm breaks. Troy's own breathing slowed. The adrenaline that had spiked through him a few moments earlier now felt like a current he could ride instead of something that might sweep him away. He sensed Mariah straighten next to him, her shoulder brushing his arm. Her presence steadied him, tethered him to something real as the moment swelled around them. Mariah's eyes scanned the faces on the edge of the crowd. She recognized people she had never met, mothers with toddlers, teenagers with backpacks, an elderly man leaning on a cane, and yet there was a strange familiarity in the way they were looking back at her. It was not pity, it was not curiosity, it was recognition, as though they were seeing their own lives reflected in hers. She felt the bruises forming on her knees, where the pavement had scraped her, the sting of a cut on her palm, the ache in her chest where Mallory's hand had held her down. She thought about how quickly dignity could be stripped away, but she also thought about how quickly it could be restored when people bore witness together. She reached for Troy's hand again, lacing their fingers tightly, a small but deliberate gesture that told the crowd she was not broken. Mallory stood a few feet away, his baton still in his hand, but the energy had shifted so completely that he no longer felt like the center of the scene. He felt instead like a single actor on a stage, whose script had been torn up in front of him. The crowd's noise pressed against his ear. He tried to calculate how to exit this moment without losing control entirely, but every possible move felt like it would only make things worse. His training told him to command, to isolate, to escalate until the target submitted. But the couple in front of him weren't submitting, and the people around him weren't dispersing. They were closing in, not with fists but with presence, a mass of eyes and phones and voices that no baton could scatter. Troy stepped forward, just enough to make Mallory adjust his foot. He wasn't threatening him, he was claiming space. The space where Mariah had been forced down, the space where his cuffs had broken, the
the space where humiliation had turned into resolve. Each step he took felt like a reversal of what had been done to them, a rewriting of the scene in real time. He kept his voice low, almost conversational, but it carried clearly, "We're done being pushed." The words weren't a slogan, they were a statement of fact. Mariah squeezed his hand, and he felt the slight tremor in her fingers, but her posture was straight, her chin. In the crowd, a young man raised his phone higher and began narrating into a live stream, his voice trembling but steadying as he spoke. "You're watching this happen right now," he said. "This is what they're doing to people." Others began doing the same, their words overlapping into a chorus of documentation. A woman near the front crouched to pick up Mariah's scattered papers, stacking them carefully and holding them close like something precious. The sight sent a ripple of emotion through Mariah. Even in chaos, strangers were reaching down to gather the pieces of her work. Mallory tried once more to assert himself. He lifted his baton a few inches, his voice hard. "Step back now," but the words fell flat. Nobody stepped back. The couple did not flinch. He saw his reflection again in the phones, dozens of tiny screens showing his posture, his weapon, his expression. He wondered who was watching from their living rooms, who might know his name, who might be already calling the station. He had always believed that his badge gave him authority. Now it felt like a weight pulling him down. Mariah drew in a breath and spoke, not to Mallory but to the crowd. "This is why we speak out," she said, her voice carrying over the noise. "This is what happens when you stand." She wasn't delivering a speech. She was naming the moment as it unfolded. People responded with shouts of agreement, their energy feeding hers. Troy felt it too, the strange shift from fear to something that felt like collective strength. It wasn't just about defending themselves anymore. It was about all the people watching, about the idea that something could change if enough eyes stayed open. Mallory's fingers twitched around the baton. He could feel the sweat on his palms, the tremor in his hand. He had entered the park thinking he was the enforcer of order. Now he felt like the embodiment of everything these people had gathered to reject. He glanced toward the edge of the crowd, hoping for backup, but saw only more faces, more phones. He opened his mouth to speak but no sound came. He closed it again, jaw tight. Troy took another small step forward, not aggressive but deliberate. The crowd murmured, a low hum that felt like approval. He looked Mallory directly in the eye. "This stops now." The words were simple but the way he said them made them sound inevitable. Mariah's grip tightened on his hand, her knuckles white. She felt her own fear recede just a little, replaced by a fierce calm. She thought of every meeting they had organized, every late night of planning, every story of injustice they had heard. All of it had led to this moment, unplanned but somehow inevitable. The crowd began chanting again, softer this time, but more unified. The rhythm of it echoed off the tree. People were holding their phones like torches, faces illuminated by the glow. Mallory stood frozen, the baton drooping slightly in his hand. He felt the smirk he had worn earlier, like a ghost on his face, a reminder of the man he had been a few minutes ago. Now he was just a man standing in front of two people, who refused to be broken, surrounded by a community that had decided to witness. The realization settled over him slowly, heavy and undeniable. Mariah looked at him, not with pleading but with clarity. She saw the shift in his posture, the hesitation in his eyes. She spoke again, her voice steady and clear. "You can't scare us anymore." The words weren't shouted, they didn't need to be. They hung in the air like a challenge, and a truth at once. The crowd murmured, in agreement. Phones captured every second, sending it outward, multiplying it beyond the park. Troy stood beside her, silent now but solid, a presence she could lean into. They were no longer reacting, they were defining the moment themselves, taking back the narrative one breath at a time. Around them the park felt changed. The playground equipment and benches were still there. The trees still swayed in the breeze, but the air was thick with a sense of shared purpose. Strangers had formed a loose semicircle, holding space, holding witness. Some were crying quietly, some were clapping, some just stood with their phones raised, recording. But all of them were part of what was happening, their presence turning an isolated act of humiliation into a public reckoning. Mariah felt the weight of that, and also the lift of it, the way it steadied her on her feet. Troy glanced at the broken cuffs at his feet, at the scattered papers, at the lost ring glinting faintly near the curb. He thought of picking it up but kept his eyes on Mallory instead. There would be time to gather what had been lost later. Right now all that mattered was holding the line, holding Mariah's hand, holding his ground. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how long the crowd's protection would last. But for the first time since the confrontation began, he felt something like control. Not the control of force, but the control of refusal, of standing firm and being seen. Mallory shifted his weight, lowering the baton a little more. His eyes flicked between the couple and the crowd, then back again. He had no words left. The noise of the crowd filled the park, but beneath it there was a strange, heavy silence, the kind of silence that precedes a decision. He felt it pressing on him, demanding something different from him than the instinct to dominate. The badge on his chest felt heavier than ever. He stared at the couple in front of him, at the people around them, at the phones pointed like dozens of eyes. He opened his mouth but closed it again, unable to form a command. In that moment the power he had assumed was his, by default felt like it had slipped entirely away.
Troy stood very still, feeling the tremor of the crowd's energy travel up through the soles of his shoes. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was a vibration, a hum, like the resonance of a drumhead after a strike. His fingers were still interlaced with Mariah's, the warmth of her palm anchoring him as he stared at Mallory. The broken cuffs on the ground gleamed dully in the sunlight. He had thought that moment, the snap of metal giving way, was the peak of everything, but now he could feel something even larger gathering around them. It was not just their private defiance, it was a current that was pulling more people in, linking strangers together into a single mass of intent. He could see it in their faces, the woman clutching Mariah's papers to her chest, the teenagers chanting, the man in the business suit who had taken off his jacket and was standing at the front now with his phone lowered, but his arms crossed as if he was ready to shield someone. All of them were looking not at their screens but at each other, glancing and nodding, small affirmations passing silently through the group. Mariah felt it too, the ache in her knees, the sting in her palm, the soreness in her throat. All of it was still there, but it was overlaid by a new awareness. She had spent years trying to wake people up with words, meetings, petitions, and now without a microphone or a podium, she could feel that awakening happening in real time. People were moving closer not out of curiosity but out of solidarity. She saw two young girls step forward and link arms, their faces pale but determined. She saw an older woman set down her shopping bag and begin to chant, her voice hoarse but steady. She saw a man kneel to pick up the lost wedding ring and hold it aloft so Mariah could see it glinting in the light, a small act of restoration amid the larger chaos. That gesture almost undid her. She swallowed hard, fighting back tears, but she lifted her chin higher. Mallory noticed the shift as well. It wasn't subtle anymore. The semicircle of bystanders had thickened into a ring that left only a small pocket of space around him and the couple. His radio squawked faintly on his belt, but the words were lost under the noise of the crowd. He reached for it, then hesitated, his hand hovering. Backup would come eventually, but how would they enter through this? How would it look when every phone captured not just one officer but a line of them pushing into a crowd of families and elders? His training told him to be the immovable center, to act decisively, but his instincts were warning him now that every decisive act would have a cost. He shifted his stance, trying to look less aggressive without looking weak, but he could feel sweat trickling down the back of his neck. Troy took a slow breath. He was aware of his own heartbeat, but it felt steady now, like the tick of a metronome. He thought of all the nights Mariah had come home from meetings exhausted but still hopeful, of all the times he had held her while she cried over another story of someone mistreated, of all the times he had promised he'd protect her. This moment, unscripted and raw, felt like the culmination of all those promises. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he would not step back. His voice when it came was low but carried across the small space. "Look around you," he said to Mallory. "You don't get to do this in the dark anymore." He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. The crowd murmured in agreement, a ripple of sound that felt like an echo of his words. Mariah squeezed his hand once, a silent signal between them. She stepped slightly forward, enough so that she was level with him rather than behind him. Her face was calm but her eyes were alight. She had been silenced physically, forced to her knees, but now her voice was free again. "This is bigger than us," she said, projecting so that the people behind could hear. "You all see what's happening. Don't forget it." She didn't raise her fist, didn't make a dramatic gesture, but the crowd responded anyway, a surge of noise that was part cheer, part affirmation. She could feel the air vibrating against her skin. Mallory's baton hung uselessly at his side. He stared at them, at the phones, at the ring of people. He tried to summon the tone that had worked so many times before, the tone of absolute authority. But when he spoke his voice cracked slightly. "You're obstructing," he began, but the rest of the sentence was drowned out by a chant that rose spontaneously from the crowd. "We see you, we see you." It rolled over him like a wave. For the first time in his career, he felt small inside his uniform, the badge on his chest not a shield but a target of their collective gaze. Troy and Mariah didn't move. They stood like two pillars in the center of the ring, holding hands, their feet planted. The chant washed over them, through them. Troy glanced down briefly, and saw the man who had picked up Mariah's ring still holding it. Their eyes met. The man stepped forward, hand outstretched, and Mariah reached to take it back. The gold band cool against her finger. She slid it onto her finger without breaking eye contact with Mallory. It was a small act, but it felt monumental. A reclamation of something stolen. The crowd erupted in applause at the sight, the sound echoing off the park's concrete paths. Mallory shifted back it wasn't a retreat, not yet, but it was the first time he had moved away from them instead of toward them. The crowd noticed. A murmur passed through, then a cheer. Phones angled to catch every angle of his movement. He gripped the baton harder, then let it drop to hang loosely from his hand. His radio squawked again, but he didn't reach for it. He could feel his options narrowing like the walls of a tunnel. He had entered this park, thinking he was the one who would decide the ending. Now he wasn't sure there was a path left for him to walk that would keep the story. Mariah felt the ring on her finger and something steadied inside her. She glanced at Troy and saw the same steadiness in him. They had been humiliated, shoved, cuffed, but now they were standing upright again, facing not just the man who had done it, but the system he represented. She spoke again, her voice softer now but still carrying. "We're standing," she said simply. The words weren't meant to be dramatic, but they resonated. People in the crowd began repeating them. "We're standing," they said, some raising their hands, some simply nodding. It spread through the ring like a current, until dozens of voices were echoing it back. Troy's throat tightened at the sound. He had never led a chant, had never wanted to be at the center of a scene like this. But hearing those words echoing back, felt like a confirmation of everything he and Mariah had worked for in quieter ways. He squeezed her hand and she squeezed back. They both turned their eyes back to Mallory. He looked different now, not just in expression but in posture. The smirk was gone, the squared shoulders softened. He looked for the first time like a man rather than a uniform. The crowd's chant shifted again, less of a chant now and more of a low, unified murmur. People were speaking to each other, not just to their phones. Someone passed a bottle of water to Mariah from the edge of the ring. Someone else bent to pick up the last of her scattered papers. Little acts of care sprouted everywhere, weaving a fabric of solidarity around the couple. It wasn't orchestrated. It was instinctive, human. Mariah felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back, not wanting to blur her vision of Mallory. Mallory's grip on the baton slackened further. He looked at the couple, at the crowd, then at the noise around him wasn't just sound now. It was a presence pressing against his skin, demanding a different kind of response. He had been trained to see crowds as potential threats, but this felt like something else, like a mirror held up to him, reflecting not just his actions but his choices. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed. His chest rose and fell. His eyes flicked to the street again. Then, Troy inhaled slowly. He had the strange sense of standing on a threshold, of something about to tip. He didn't know if it would tip toward violence or toward some other outcome, but he knew that whatever happened next would be remembered. He could feel the weight of history pressing into this moment, heavy but also clarifying. He thought of the stories his grandparents had told him, of marches and sit-ins, of times when ordinary people had refused to move. He thought of Mariah's voice at rallies, of the way she had always believed that dignity was contagious. He realized now she had been right. Mariah's voice came once more, clear and unwavering. "We're not alone," she said. She wasn't asking, she was naming what was already true. The crowd responded with a cheer that rolled over the park like thunder. Phones tilted upward to catch the sound. Even the birds startled from the trees at the edges, rising into the sky. Mallory stood in the center of it, looking around at the faces, at the couple, at the baton in his hand. He had come to this park, expecting routine control. He had found something else entirely. The noise swelled again, not chaotic but unified, a living wall of sound and presence surrounding him, and the couple who had refused to kneel quietly. Troy felt as if the park itself was holding its breath. The chants had subsided into a low murmur, but the energy had not diminished. It had condensed, tightened, like a coiled spring. People were no longer just watching, but aligning themselves, bodies angled toward him and Mariah, their faces. He could hear snatches of conversation at the edges. Someone on a call describing the scene, someone else explaining to a child what was happening. But even those voices carried a tone of solemnity. He tightened his grip on Mariah's hand, and felt her squeeze. The broken cuffs at his feet were no longer just metal. They were a symbol, and he could see people's eyes flicking to them, then to his raw wrists,
then back to Mallory. Every detail was being absorbed and transmitted outward through dozens of phones, a live current of images and words stretching far beyond the park. Mariah's heart pounded, but her breathing was steady now. She could see the way strangers were glancing at each other, nodding, shifting forward in small increments. She had dreamed of solidarity for years, had tried to build it in meetings and petitions. But this was something different. Spontaneous. Unplanned, yet she watched a teenager lower his phone and step closer, his hands empty but his posture protective. She saw an older man remove his hat and hold it against his chest, his eyes fixed on Mallory. She saw two mothers exchange a look, then move their strollers to the front as if to say, "This is ours too." These small gestures knitted the crowd into a single body, and Mariah felt herself standing taller inside it. Mallory felt the shift in the air as clearly as if the temperature had changed. The uniform on his back felt heavy, his badge hot against his chest. He could sense that the old dynamic, the officer in control, the crowd compliant, had dissolved. He scanned the ring of faces and phones, and realized with a jolt that he no longer knew which way this could go. He had thought humiliation would end this couple's resistance, but instead it had ignited something he couldn't measure. His training had taught him to escalate, until submission, but escalation now felt like stepping off a ledge. He flexed his fingers around the baton and then loosened them again, unsure. Troy shifted his weight slightly, not advancing but grounding himself. He was acutely aware of every sensation, the roughness of Mariah's palm, the hum of the crowd, the faint metallic taste of adrenaline at the back of his throat. He felt like a conduit for something larger than himself, something that had begun the moment Mariah's ring hit the pavement, and the phones rose like a forest of small antennas. He thought of all the nights they had lain awake talking about change, about how slow it was, how hopeless it sometimes felt. And now here it was, not as a policy or a speech, but as a living surge of people refusing to look away. Mariah tilted her head slightly, and looked at Mallory. His smirk was gone, his shoulders no longer squared. She could see his eyes darting, calculating. She realized he was as trapped by this moment as they were, though in a different way. She wondered if he understood yet that he wasn't just dealing with a husband and wife, but with a mirror held up to an entire system. She thought of the stories she had told in church basements and community centers, the faces that had listened, and how those stories were now being enacted live, unfiltered, impossible to deny. She spoke quietly but clearly, her words carrying. Everyone sees now. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. A ripple moved through the crowd at her words. People straightened, phones lifted a little higher, as if to punctuate the statement. Mallory's jaw clenched. He opened his mouth but no sound came. His radio crackled again, louder this time, but he didn't reach for it. He was staring at them, at the crowd, at the circle closing around him. For the first time he looked less like an authority figure, and more like a man in a uniform, small inside the enormity of the moment. Troy's voice came low and steady. It ends here. He didn't know what exactly he meant. The humiliation, the pattern, the moment, but he knew the words felt right. The crowd murmured again, a low echo, and several people nodded. He could feel Mariah's fingers trembling in his, but her grip was. He turned slightly toward her, their shoulders touching, presenting not two individuals, but a united front. Around them the air seemed to thicken, the smell of grass and asphalt, mixing with sweat and something like anticipation. Mallory took a small step back. It was almost imperceptible, but the crowd noticed. A murmur rose, then a cheer. Phones angled to capture the movement. He shifted again, his baton lowering another inch. He glanced at the street beyond the park, but then back at the couple. His lips parted as if to speak, then closed. The hum of the crowd filled the space where his authority had been. Mariah felt the change ripple outward. She saw strangers smiling at each other now, still tense but buoyed by a sense of shared agency. She thought of the word she had used for years, witness, and realized they were beyond witness now. They were participants. She inhaled deeply, and held Troy's hand tighter. The ring on her finger felt like an anchor, cool against her skin. She met Mallory's eyes and did not look away. In her chest the fear had been replaced by a calm certainty. They had been pushed down, but they had risen, and now everyone was watching to see what would happen next. Sirens began to wail somewhere beyond the park, but the crowd didn't scatter. Instead people linked arms tighter, a living barrier around Troy and Mariah. The broken cuffs glinted on the ground like a warning, and a promise. Mariah's voice rose again, steady and clear, and her words rippled outward through hundreds of phones streaming live. Troy stood beside her, shoulders squared, every breath measured as the energy of the crowd swelled into something that felt unstoppable. Faces lit by screens and sunlight turned toward them, not as spectators but as allies, their chants rolling together into a single pulse that filled the park and spilled into the street.